The mountain man traded his gold for the obese girl. The reason will make you cry. The winter of 1823 came early to the frontier settlement of Red Ridge, Colorado, a place where civilization hung by a thread and mercy was a luxury few could afford. The town sprawled across a valley nestled between the Rocky Mountains, its wooden structures weathered by harsh winds and unforgiving seasons. It was the kind of place where desperation bred cruelty, and kindness was often mistaken for weakness. The saloon, called the Broken Wheel, sat at the heart of Red Ridge like a cancerous tumor. Its floors were warped from years of spilled whiskey and tobacco juice. The walls bore the scars of countless brawls, bullet holes, knife marks, and the general deterioration that came from housing humanity at its most vicious. This was where men came to forget their failures, drown their sorrows, and often enough, inflict their pain on whoever was vulnerable enough to absorb it. Mary Beth Sutherland had been working at the Broken Wheel for 3 years. She'd arrived in Red Ridge as a girl of 17, orphaned and desperate, fleeing a life of poverty in the eastern states. The saloon's owner, a man named Garrett Voss, had taken her in, though "taken her in" was a generous phrase for what amounted to indentured servitude. She cooked, cleaned, served drinks, and endured the endless mockery that came with her appearance. Mary Beth was large, not the sturdy, strong large of a frontier woman accustomed to hard labor, but genuinely obese. Her body had always been this way, even as a child. Genetics and poverty had conspired against her, resulting in a frame that the frontier society found both pathetic and offensive. In a land where survival depended on strength and utility, Mary Beth represented weakness and burden. The men of Red Ridge took particular pleasure in her humiliation. They would call her names, grab her roughly when she served them, occasionally throw food at her feet as if she were a dog. Voss encouraged this behavior, finding it entertaining and profitable. Men drank more when they had someone to bully. Mary Beth learned to move through the saloon like a ghost, keeping her eyes down, her voice soft, and her dreams locked away in a compartment of her heart she tried never to access. On the night of December 15th, 1823, everything changed. Mary Beth had made a mistake. A wealthy merchant from Denver had come to Red Ridge with 3 associates, and they'd ordered a special meal, roasted game and fresh vegetables, a rare luxury. Mary Beth had spent hours preparing it, working carefully in the cramped kitchen behind the saloon. The food was good. She took pride in her cooking, one of the few things in her life she could control and do well. But when she served it, the merchant took one bite and began to choke. An herb she'd used, something she believed was sage but turned out to be something else, something toxic, had caused his throat to swell. His associates rushed him out into the night, screaming that he was dying, threatening legal action, and worse. Voss exploded. He stormed into the kitchen where Mary Beth was frantically trying to understand what had happened. His face was purple with rage, spittle flying from his mouth. He called her every vile name he could conjure, then went further, inventing new ones. He told her she was worthless, a parasite, a waste of food and air. He said she ate too much anyway. Why should she be allowed to eat when she was so obviously not worth feeding? He said she brought in no money, attracted no decent customers, and existed only to degrade the saloon's reputation. "Get out!" he finally screamed, his voice raw. "Get out of my sight! I'm done with you! You're finished here!" Pshaw! Mary Beth tried to explain, tried to apologize, but Voss wasn't interested in explanations. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip brutal enough to leave bruises, and physically dragged her toward the door. Other patrons watched with various expressions, some amused, some uncomfortable, but none moved to intervene. Intervention was dangerous in places like Red Ridge. It marked you as soft. When they reached the saloon's entrance, Voss shoved her outside with such force that she stumbled and fell into the snow. He threw her thin coat after her, the pathetic garment landing several feet away. The temperature was dropping rapidly. The sky was thick with clouds, and the wind carried the promise of a brutal storm. "Don't come back!" Voss snarled. "You're done! Finished! Find some other fool to feed you!" The door slammed shut. Mary Beth lay in the snow for a long moment, her body heaving with sobs she couldn't suppress. She was 20 years old. She had nowhere to go, no family, no money, and she was about to experience a Colorado mountain winter with virtually nothing. The realization of her situation cascaded over her like an avalanche, suffocating in its finality. She didn't see the man in the corner of the saloon who had witnessed everything. Eli Turner was 53 years old, and he'd spent the last 25 of those years in the mountains of the Colorado Territory. He'd come west as a young man in 1798, fleeing a life in Kentucky that had become unbearable after his wife and daughter died of fever. The mountains had saved him, or at least they'd given him a purpose for continuing to live. He'd learned to trap, to hunt, to survive in conditions that would have killed most men. He'd fought Ute warriors, grizzly bears, and the unforgiving wilderness itself. He'd become something hard and weathered, like the granite peaks that surrounded him. Eli was in Redridge that night because he needed supplies and because he was tired, bone-deep tired, the kind of tired that came from decades of solitude and struggle. He'd been alone so long that human company had become almost unbearable to him. The men in towns like Redridge seemed like creatures from another world, soft, petty, cruel in small ways that suggested their cruelty came from moral weakness rather than necessity. He was nursing a whiskey in the corner, planning to finish it and head back to his cabin high in the mountains when the incident with Mary Beth unfolded. He saw everything. The young woman's careful attempts to serve the merchant properly, her obvious pride in the meal she'd prepared, her shock when things went wrong. He saw Voss's disproportionate rage, the cruelty that went beyond punishment and ventured into something much darker, something that suggested the saloon owner had been waiting for an excuse to unleash his ugliness on her. And he saw the other patrons watching with amusement or indifference, no one moving to help her, no one saying anything. Eli had learned long ago not to involve himself in the petty dramas of civilized society. He'd made a rule: help no one, trust no one, and accept that frontier society sorted itself out through natural brutality. It was a harsh philosophy, but it had served him well. It had kept him alive. But as he sat there, watching Mary Beth struggle to her feet in the snow, something inside him cracked. It wasn't mercy exactly. Eli wasn't a merciful man. It was something else, a recognition perhaps of shared suffering. He'd known what it was like to be cast out, to be unwanted, to be so utterly alone that death seemed preferable to continuing. He'd survived that darkness, but survival had left him hollow. The young woman was going to die. Not immediately, probably, but within days. She had no shelter, no resources, and the mountains showed no mercy to the unprepared. In a week, if she lasted that long, they'd find her frozen corpse, and the men of Redridge would joke about it while they drank. Eli Turner stood up. He was a large man himself, though in him the size was muscle and bone rather than fat. His face was weathered to the color and texture of old leather. His hair, which fell past his shoulders, was shot through with gray. He wore buckskin and furs, and he moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago never to waste energy on unnecessary movements. He walked to the bar where Voss was now boasting to his friends about how he'd handled the problem. "Bartender," Eli said. His voice was hoarse. He didn't speak often. "How much for a week's worth of supplies? A week's food, blankets, enough to survive in the mountains?" Voss looked at him with confusion. "What's it to you, mountain man? Just answer the question." Voss named a price, an inflated one, the kind he charged people he didn't know or particularly liked. Eli reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. From it, He extracted a single gold coin. It was Spanish gold, rare and valuable. It was also the last thing of significant value he owned, the last hedge against truly desperate circumstances. He placed it on the bar. "That's for a week's supplies," he said, "and it's for her, the girl you just threw out." The saloon erupted in laughter. Men slapped the bar, doubled over. Some actually fell backward in their chairs. The humor was the cruel kind, the kind that came from genuine bewilderment at what they perceived as insanity. "You buying yourself a wife, old man?" someone shouted. "Going to take her up to the mountains, and she's coming with me," Eli said, cutting off whatever obscenity was about to follow. "I'm leaving now. Have the supplies ready. And if anyone's got a problem with it, this would be the time to speak up." He said it quietly, without particular emphasis, but there was something in his tone, something that suggested that having a problem with it would result in consequences none of them would enjoy experiencing. Eli had killed men. He'd killed them over serious matters and over trivial ones, because in the mountains, you didn't always get to choose your battles. It was said that he was the fastest with a pistol in 3 territories, though Eli himself never claimed any such thing. No one spoke up. He walked to the door and went out into the snow. Mary Beth was struggling to gather her coat, her fingers already numb, when Eli emerged from the saloon. She looked up at him with a mixture of fear and resignation. She'd learned long ago that strange men usually meant trouble, especially for girls like her, though in her experience, trouble usually came in the form of mockery rather than anything more violent. "Come on," Eli said. He wrapped a heavy fur coat around her shoulders, his own coat leaving him in just buckskin and a wool shirt. "We need to move. Storm's coming." Mary Beth didn't move. "I don't know you," she said. Her voice was thin, frightened. "No," Eli agreed. "You don't. But I know what happens to people when they're left alone in weather like this. I've seen it. I don't recommend it. Come on." Something in his tone, the lack of cruelty, the apparent acceptance that she was a person worth keeping alive, made Mary Beth move. He led her to where his horse was tied, a sturdy mountain pony that looked like it could handle rough terrain and worse. He lifted her onto its back with surprising gentleness, mounted behind her, and they rode out into the growing blizzard. The journey to his cabin took 8 hours. It should have taken 4, but the storm intensified, and they had to move slowly. Mary Beth was freezing, despite the fur coat, and she drifted in and out of consciousness. Eli kept talking to her, not in any kind personal way, but steady commentary about the trail, the storm, the mountains. The sound of his voice seemed to keep her tethered to consciousness. "Storm's a bad one," he said at one point, "but we've got shelter ahead. Not much, but enough. You stay with me, you'll be fine." When they finally reached the cabin, it was nearly midnight. It was a small structure, built of rough logs and chinked with mud and moss. Inside, it was sparse but organized. There was a fireplace, a cot with a blanket, a table and chair, and shelves holding supplies. A rifle hung above the fireplace. Everything was clean and carefully maintained. Eli started a fire while Mary Beth huddled near the entrance, too confused and exhausted to fully comprehend what was happening. Once the fire was going, he brought her water and made her drink. He gave her a blanket and told her to sit by the fire and warm up. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He made her soup, something from a pot he'd apparently prepared earlier and left to sit. It was thick with vegetables, and what she suspected was dried meat. It was the most nourishing thing she'd eaten in months. She consumed 3 bowls of it while Eli sat across from her, the firelight casting half his face in shadow. "Why?" she asked finally, once her stomach had stopped its desperate cramping. "Why did you help me?" Eli was quiet for a long time. "Because they were wrong to do it," he said finally, "and because I could." That was as close as he would come to explaining himself for a long time. Mary Beth stayed through the winter. She had no choice, really. The mountains were impassable, and she had no skills for survival in such an environment. But as the weeks passed, no choice transformed into something more like acceptance, and eventually into something that might have approached contentment. Eli taught her things: how to split wood for the fire, how to mend clothing, how to make food last. He taught her the names of the plants that grew in the higher elevations and which ones were poisonous. He taught her to read the sky and understand weather patterns. He was not a patient teacher. He expected her to listen carefully and not repeat mistakes, but he was thorough and fair. Mary Beth, for the first time in her life, experienced something like respect. Eli didn't mock her size or her appearance. He treated her as a person with competence to develop, not as a burden to be tolerated. He listened when she spoke, actually listened, and answered her questions seriously. She learned his story gradually, in fragments. His wife and daughter had died of fever in 1798. He'd come west to escape the grief and had never left. He'd spent 25 years alone, mostly by choice. He wasn't a man accustomed to company, and Mary Beth had to learn to read his moods and understand that his silences weren't rejection, but simply his natural state. She fell in love with him sometime in February, though she didn't realize it at first. She only knew that her heart began to race when she heard him coming back from checking his traps, that she spent extra time preparing meals, that she paid careful attention to her appearance, what appearance she could cultivate with limited resources in a mountain cabin. Eli seemed not to notice, or perhaps he did, and was simply too honorable to take advantage of a young woman who had nowhere else to go. By March, when the snow began to melt, Mary Beth was terrified. She knew that once the passes cleared, she would have to leave. Eli couldn't keep her forever. It wasn't proper, and more than that, it wasn't practical. Mountain trappers didn't have companions. They had supplies and solitude and nothing else. It was mid-April when the bandits came. There were 5 of them, men from the lower territories who preyed on isolated settlers and trappers. They'd been ranging through the mountains looking for easy targets. Eli's cabin, while remote, wasn't invisible, and the smoke from his chimney had drawn their attention. They appeared on a morning when Eli had gone out early to check on his traps. Mary Beth was inside, working on a hide that Eli had been processing. She heard the sound of horses and recognized immediately that something was wrong. Eli moved quietly, without the clamoring noise these riders made. She recognized one of them from Redridge, a man named Carsons, who'd been particularly vicious in his mockery of her. He was laughing as they rode up to the cabin, already making plans about what they'd find and what they'd do with it. Mary Beth's first instinct was to hide. She'd become quite good at hiding. It was something she'd learned as a child in the crowded, hostile environments she had inhabited before coming to Redridge. She slipped into the corner space between the fireplace and the back wall, a gap just large enough for someone of her size to squeeze into. It was dark there, and unless someone was specifically looking, they wouldn't find her. The men entered roughly, overturning the table, kicking at the cot, searching for anything of value. They found Eli's rifle, his tools, his few precious items. They were so focused on the cabin's contents that they didn't hear the movement behind them. Eli came in through the back window, a trick he'd taught Mary Beth, though she'd never expected to see him use it. He moved like violence itself, and before the bandits could fully register his presence, 2 of them were on the ground with bullets in them. The remaining 3 reacted faster than Mary Beth would have thought possible, drawing their own weapons. A firefight erupted in the confined space of the cabin. Bullets tore through the wooden walls. One of the bandits, not Carson's, got a shot off that caught Eli in the shoulder, spinning him partially around. The injury seemed to enrage him. He didn't hesitate or slow down. He simply pressed forward, and within seconds, the remaining 2 bandits were down. Eli stood in the center of the cabin, breathing hard, blood soaking through his shirt. He looked at the bodies with something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been disgust. Mary Beth couldn't quite tell. Then he seemed to remember where he was and what had happened, and he looked toward the corner where Mary Beth had hidden. "You okay?" he asked, his voice strained. She emerged and immediately saw the blood. The wound was bad. The bullet had gone deep, and there was a lot of bleeding. She sprang into action, forgetting her own fear, focused entirely on the practical problem of keeping Eli alive. She got him to the cot and removed his shirt. The wound was indeed serious, but the bullet hadn't hit any major vessels, at least not fatally. She cleaned it as best she could, using whiskey to sterilize and cloth to bind it. She'd never done anything like this before, but necessity and desperation lent her skill and focus. For 3 days, Eli ran in a fever. Mary Beth barely slept sitting beside him, applying cool cloths to his forehead, making sure he drank enough water and broth. She watched him toss and turn, heard him say things in his fever dreams, names of people long dead, fragments of memories from a life she'd never fully understand. When the fever finally broke on the 3rd night, Eli woke to find Mary Beth asleep in the chair beside him, her head tilted back, her face illuminated by the firelight. He watched her for a long time before turning his face away, overwhelmed by feelings he'd thought he'd buried 25 years ago. Eli recovered slowly. The wound was serious enough that he couldn't do his usual work, couldn't check traps or hunt. For the first time in years, he was dependent on someone else, and he hated it, even as he grudgingly accepted its necessity. It was during this period that Mary Beth decided she had to speak, even if it cost her everything. She was making breakfast one morning in late April when she simply said it, no preamble, no softening. "I don't want to leave when the trail's clear." Eli was sitting at the table, his shoulder still heavily bandaged but beginning to heal. He looked up from his coffee. "There's nowhere else for me to go," she continued quickly, as if speed would make the words hurt less. "And I know you don't want me here, not permanently, but I'm useful. I can cook, I can help with the work. I can—" She stopped, realizing how this sounded, how it echoed the language of transaction and utility that had defined her entire life. "It's not that I don't want you here," Eli said quietly. He set down his coffee carefully. "That's not the problem." "Then what is?" Mary Beth asked, and there was real pain in her voice. "Because I'm useful. I know I am. I'm not lazy or stupid. I worked hard. I know you did," Eli interrupted. "You are useful. You're also smart and capable and stronger than you know. That's not why I can't ask you to stay." "Why then?" Eli was quiet for so long that Mary Beth thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Because you deserve better than this. Better than a broken-down old mountain man in a cabin. You deserve a life, a real one, with someone closer to your own age, someone who can give you—" He gestured vaguely, searching for words he clearly didn't possess. "I don't want someone else," Mary Beth said, and there was steel in her voice now. "I don't want a life in some town where people spit at me in the streets. I want this. I want the mountains. I want to work and to be treated like I matter. I want—" She stopped, unable to articulate the deepest truth. "I want you." Eli flinched at that visibly. He looked away. "You don't know what you're saying." "I do," Mary Beth said. "I'm not grateful and confused if that's what you think. I've had time to think. I've had months. I know exactly what I'm saying." She came and sat across from him at the table. "I know you've been alone so long you don't know how to be anything else, but you don't have to be. Not anymore." Eli looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his weathered face. She saw the moment his resolve cracked. She saw the moment he allowed himself to want something beyond survival. "I'm old," he said finally, and it was barely a whisper. "I don't care," Mary Beth replied. "You're the best man I've ever known." They married quietly that summer. There was no ceremony, no official recognition. Frontier society didn't recognize such things for people in their circumstances. But Eli crafted her a ring from a piece of silver he'd been saving for purposes he'd long ago forgotten, and Mary Beth wore it with pride. The cabin became their home in a way it hadn't been before. Eli began to talk more, opening up about his past, his wife, his daughter, the life he'd led before sorrow had driven him to the mountains. Mary Beth listened and held his pain, and over time, she watched some of the hardness in him soften. That first winter together, Mary Beth became pregnant. The realization terrified her. She was 21 years old, had no medical training beyond what she'd learned in the cabin, and was living in a remote mountain location where the nearest help was a 3-day journey away. Eli responded to her fears not with reassurance, but with practical action. He built a larger cabin, reinforcing it against the winter winds. He brought in supplies, including a midwifery book he'd somehow acquired from a trader in Red Ridge. He prepared for every contingency he could imagine. In June of 1825, Mary Beth gave birth to a daughter. The labor was long and difficult, and for a terrifying span of hours, Eli thought he might lose her. But Mary Beth had developed the kind of strength that comes from survival and from love, and she pushed through the agony with a determination that left Eli in awe. Their daughter was small and perfect, with her mother's dark hair and her father's intense eyes. They named her Elizabeth, after Eli's lost daughter, honoring the past while creating a new future. The birth changed something fundamental in Eli. Fatherhood, the second time around, reminded him of why he'd survived all these years. It was not to hide in the mountains, but to build something worth building. Over the next 3 years, Mary Beth had 2 more children, a son named James in 1826 and another daughter, Catherine, in 1828. The cabin that had once housed a solitary mountain man now overflowed with life and noise and love. By 1830, Eli Turner had become something of a legend in the territories, the isolated mountain man with a wife and children, the trapper who'd become a family man. Some who knew the story, and eventually the story made its way down to the valleys and towns, spoke of it with a kind of wonder. A man so hardened by the wilderness that he'd forgotten how to be human, suddenly transformed by a simple act of kindness and a woman's determination to love him. The people of Red Ridge, particularly those who'd been there that winter night in 1823, had their own version of the story. They told of the mountain man who'd traded his last gold coin for an obese girl, and though some versions included mockery, more and more included a grudging respect. There was something in that act, something so fundamentally counter to the brutality of frontier life, that demanded acknowledgement. Garrett Voss, who'd owned the Broken Wheel, died in 1827, falling from a horse while drunk. No one mourned him particularly. The saloon changed hands several times before eventually burning down under mysterious circumstances in 1829. Mary Beth never returned to Red Ridge, though she heard stories of her old home. She chose to remain in the mountains, in the cabin that had become her sanctuary, raising her children in a place where kindness was lived rather than preached, where strength was measured not in cruelty but in the ability to protect and provide for those you loved. She became skilled in the ways of the wilderness. She could hunt and track almost as well as Eli. She could deliver babies and set broken bones. She could preserve food for the winter and navigate by the stars. She became what frontier women were supposed to be, capable, resilient, essential to survival. But more than that, she became happy. In the world's view, she was still an obese woman living in isolation in the mountains, cut off from what civilization had to offer. And yet, she possessed something that most women in civilized society never achieved: genuine contentment and self-worth. Eli, for his part, had his faith in humanity somewhat restored. He'd spent 25 years convinced that the world was cruel and people inherently vicious. Mary Beth had taught him otherwise, not through naivete or willful blindness, but through her own demonstrated strength of character. She'd survived abandonment and cruelty and deprivation, and rather than becoming bitter or hard, she'd chosen kindness and gratitude. They became an unlikely beacon in the mountains. Other settlers, particularly women fleeing difficult circumstances, sought them out. Eli and Mary Beth took in a few of these people over the years, offering shelter and work and dignity. The cabin complex grew, eventually encompassing several smaller structures. It became known as a place where you could start over, where you weren't judged for your past, where work meant respect and kindness was more than an empty word. In 1835, when Eli Turner was 65 years old, he commissioned a local artisan to create a small memorial. It was a simple thing, a bronze plaque mounted on a stone marker placed at the edge of the property. It read, "In memory of the gold coin that bought more than gold can measure. Given in kindness, it purchased not commodities but hope, love, and redemption. May all who see this remember that a single act of mercy has echoes that ripple through a lifetime and beyond." Eli never explained the memorial to anyone, though Mary Beth understood immediately. He was commemorating that night in the broken wheel, that moment when he'd placed his last coin on the bar. He was saying, in the way a man of few words could, that it had been the best trade of his life. Mary Beth lived to be 73 years old, and Eli to 82. Their children grew up strong and capable, carrying forward the values their parents had instilled: compassion without weakness, strength without cruelty, dignity without arrogance. The story of the mountain man and the obese girl spread across the territories and eventually, through the generations, became part of frontier legend. It was told in saloons and around campfires, growing more elaborate with each retelling, but the core of it remained unchanged. In a harsh world, one man's kindness had created a sanctuary. In a life marked by rejection, one woman's courage had demanded to be loved, and out of that intersection of need and mercy, something genuine and beautiful had grown. The gold coin itself disappeared from history. Garrett Voss had pocketed it, and it had changed hands many times over the years, losing all meaning except its monetary value. But the ledger of kindness that it represented, the record of what it had purchased, remained written in the lives of 5 people: Eli, Mary Beth, Elizabeth, James, and Catherine, and in all those whose lives they touched in the years that followed. In the end, that was what the mountain man had traded for: not a wife, not a companion, but a reason to live, a reason to build rather than merely survive, a reason to believe that redemption was possible, even for someone as damaged and isolated as he had been. And in purchasing that reason with his last coin, he had become wealthy in ways that no gold could ever measure.